So we don't have a shortage of land, you don't have a shortage of capital, you don't have a shortage of labor. Why is this not combining in the same way that it is combining in China? The only explanation is that
what should they be optimistic about going into 2026?
if we do the deregulation, decriminalisation, decentralisation and digitization, see, the rich countries became rich by growing at 3% for 100 years. I don't think we'll be doing 11% growth, but I think
Namaste, sir. Thank you so much for being on Bharat Varta again.
Thank you. Wonderful to be back.
Yeah, always a pleasure hosting you. I want to start with something that you said, which is that infrastructure and financing has moved from being a dagger in the heart to a thorn in the flesh, right? So which means deregulation is the real low-hanging fruit for us, right? And you've said that it can enable somewhere between 8 to 10% growth for us as well. Now, it seems like an obvious thing. Why hasn't it been done?
I mean, see, next year will be 35 years of 1991. And I know 1991 was very impactful, but it was incomplete, right? China and India had the same per capita income in 1990. I don't want to live in China, but I obviously admire or feel jealous of the fact that they have moved 400 million people off farms in the same period. And so the most embarrassing number about India, I think, right now, or the most painful, let's call it, is that 44% of our labor force still works on farms. The only way to help farmers is to have less farmers. So it's not about, fixing farming. It is about creating non-farm jobs. And so why haven't we created non-farm jobs since 1990? Why has the flow of jobs since 1991 not changed the stock of jobs since 1975, since 1968 in some senses? And I think the cultural explanations for this are always silly, right? The Hindu rate of growth went from 2% to 7% without shooting all the Hindus. So clearly that was racism or the soft bigotry of low expectations. And in recent years, factories like Foxconn, I mean, we gave them thousands of employees, have been able to find employees. So skills, which was originally positioned as a binding constraint, it's still a thorn in the flesh. It's not a dagger in the heart. It needs work, but it has gotten much better, primarily because school education has gotten much better, right? The K-12 pipeline has, the Asar report, which used to be a depressing piece of work, which did surveys on school education, for the first time now shows that learning outcomes are higher, more kids are in school, and they're learning more in school, and that becomes the opening balance for skills, right? So I think that if you eliminate culture, if you eliminate skills, if you eliminate infrastructure, the only possible explanation for why China and India, who started with the same per capita income in 1990, and they are now 5 times more than us, is how do land, labor, capital combine? Right? What economists call total factor productivity. You can call it entrepreneurship. You can call it innovation. So we don't have a shortage of land. You can give every Indian household half an acre. They would fit into Rajasthan and Maharashtra. You don't have a shortage of capital. 50% of India's FDI since 1947 has come in the last 6 years. You don't have a shortage of labor. 40% of our labor force is Vela. So why is this not combining in the same way that it is combining in China or combining in other places? And the only explanation is that the premature load bearing on entrepreneurs, which was created by the thousands of acts, by the thousands of rules, compliances, notifications, but more importantly, by a toxic regulatory mentality, which sort of thinks about things prohibited till permitted, right? I have been asked more than 100 times in my life by a bureaucrat, who allowed you to do this? Now, that's a profound question from a theory of knowledge perspective, because how will you possibly know? Innovation by definition has to be permissionless. I think the challenge with reforming this is that while business has become more competitive, politics has become more competitive, but the civil service has not been interrogated, or the administrative state has not been questioned either in 1991 or any time since. So we all go with Sardar Patel's framing of the steel cage, a steel frame, but the steel frame has become a steel cage in my mind. So I would say that the civil service, it becomes too much of an ambition or too much of an impossibility to equate ease of doing business with civil service reform. But some days I think that ease of doing business is now civil service reform. And so deregulation obviously will involve civil services reform, decentralization, fixing courts, many things. But I think we have found a particular list of activities that we should have got done in 1991 around freeing up enterprises. There is no other explanation for 6.3 crore enterprises only translating to 30,000 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores.
Yeah. Right. So you mentioned civil service reforms. Many would say that the way Indian state is set up, it is extractive in nature. It's a continuing colonial project of civilizing the masses per se, right? Which is why we have ridiculous positions like district collector, even now, 70 plus years after independence and so on. How do we go about reforming the civil services?
I mean, it's basically the same way that any organization would go reforming its HR. You first think of organization structure. I mean, the pyramid has become a cylinder, right? There are 98 additional DGs in UP. My father was in the police. There used to be one IG in every state. So the fact that everybody goes to the top really makes no sense. So first is we have to restore. We don't need 200 people with the rank of Secretary of Government of India in Delhi. So you restore the pyramid where in fact, all of us have started not only going to pyramids, we started going to Eiffel Towers, where there's a broad base and there are very few people at the top. So you need to go back to some kind of organization structure. You need to go back to some kind of performance management. The 99% ranked outstanding. Today, 99% in the people in the Indian Audit and Account Service or Indian Administrative Service are ranked outstanding. That makes no sense. If you treat Gadha Ghoda equally, it is the Gadha who sort of celebrates and the Ghoda gets frustrated, right? So I think the government punishes its good performers by not punishing its bad performers. So I think performance management would be the second one. The third one would just be in thinking about staffing and selection in ways that recognize specialization. I think the generalist is useful. But I think that the Indian economy is so complex that either you pick these generalists and make them specialize over a few years, or 25% of positions should be from lateral entry. Right? Germans have a wonderful term called Fingerutzspel. You develop intuition in your fingertips by doing the same thing for 25 years. There's very little Fingerutzspel when people become secretary in the government of India because they're getting moved around. Now, I know they have some sort of intuition about the political economy, but I think economics is now much more specialized than it used to be. I think infrastructure is much more specialized. I think even the social sector is more specialized than it used to be. If you want to fix schools, intuitively you might say, smaller class sizes, teacher salaries and teacher qualifications are what you need. But actually it needs performance management and governance, which only somebody who has worked in schools can do. So I'd say first you fix the structures. I don't think you need 75 ministries in Delhi. The US only has 14 cabinet ministers. Japan has 8. US has 14, and UK has 22. So we need to crush the number of ministries. We need to move them back to being an Eiffel Tower rather than a cylinder. We need performance management. We need staffing and selection. And I think we need a new tone from the top. Civil servants are not ruling India. They are meant to govern India. I think the notion that, and it's not 6,700 IAS officers, it's actually 25 million civil servants. And I think deregulation, decriminalization, and digitization are almost prerequisites for converting the civil servants into servants of, Nehru once said Indian civil servants are neither Indian nor civil nor a servant. And in some sense, he was reacting to the British civil service. But some of those structures were not dismantled after independence. And so I think civil service reform is one of India's overdue projects. And it may be becoming the binding constraint because politics is much more competitive than it used to be. It's much more strategic than it used to be. I think business is much more competitive and strategic. I think IPL has made cricket much more competitive than the Ranji Trophy ever was. OTT has made Bollywood much more competitive than it used to be. I think venture capital has made business much more competitive. But the civil service incentives, structures, selection, performance management has not changed. So I think that, and it's not, again, I'd like to say it's not the 6,700 IAS officers, it's the 25 million civil servants. And one way to enable civil service would be a new tone from the top that doesn't treat business with suspicion. Behind
Right.
every great fortune does not lie a great crime.
Right.
And that may have been true in the license Raj. It's no longer true in an era where you have phone pay, where you have Flipkart, where you have all these other first generation entrepreneurs who have raised venture capital, who have hired senior people, and who have built scale in India. So I think there is a new tone from the top also as a part of civil service reform, which says deregulation, decriminalization, and digitization are very important, because there are 26,410 ways for an employer to go to jail. Now, not many people are in jail. So you have to ask yourself, is this criminal provisions really working? Many civil servants would say, yes, the deterrent is working because nobody is in jail. But really, there were only 8 cases for ticketless travel filed by Indian Railways last year out of the 70 crore travelers. Were there only 8 ticketless travelers, or were ticket collectors collecting the bribe and letting people do ticketless travel, right? So why not make it a civilian offense? Why not charge them 4 times the fare? Why not deboard them from the train, right? So I think there are multiple examples I can give you. In my mind, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, it should have a very strict, and it has a 10-year jail provision for fraud.
Right.
It should have that. But it doesn't need 122-year jail provisions for stupidity. For filing a form illegal, for having a board meeting. Stupidity is not illegal. It's definitely not jailable. So there's no reason why we should have these jail provisions in corporate affairs. You can threaten to delist a company. You can threaten to do so many things. So my sense is that decriminalization is an important part of the project. But decriminalization will take a lot of regulatory cholesterol and make it not jailable. But you also need to get rid of the regulatory cholesterol, right? Do we need licenses outside 4 areas? National security, public health, public safety, and environment? I think you should just have perpetual self-registration. Why should you have a license? License should only in areas where there are externalities or where you can cause harm. So getting rid of licenses is part of deregulation. Why should you have inspections which are done at the whim and fancy of the inspector? They should be random. They should be risk-based inspection. There is no reason for you to have. Why should you have licenses which are issued for 6 months or 1 year? All licenses should be perpetual. Why should you have multiple instruments for regulation? Actually, the Constitution is very clear. You have acts and you have rules. There is only one level of subsidiary legislation. But the administrative state has invented these 14 other instruments. Guidelines, circular, notification, office order, government memorandum. These are actually not constitutionally kosher. So why should we not have a deadline of 15th June or 1st December next year where we tell the administrative state anything not in an act or not notified in the Gazette is not enforceable? And we should have a single website or a single source of truth where all acts and rules should be there. And we must say that no citizen or enterprise is required to comply with anything outside this website or this repository. It is not a very big ask. Actually, deregulation, in some sense, Article 19 of the Constitution gives us freedom to operate professionally and do business without any restrictions. So licenses, in some sense, should only be very sparingly used. But we have more than 560 licenses or NOCs or prior approvals at the central government level. So I think the project of India of Purna Swaraj, from a political perspective, is often misused when I ask for deregulation. I'm not asking for Purna Swaraj for enterprises. If no state created hotbeds of venture capital, then Swat Valley in Afghanistan and Waziristan in Pakistan would be hotbeds of venture capital. A state is a very important part of the entrepreneurial network. But I think the 1956 Avadi Resolution, the 1968 nationalization, the 1976 42nd Amendment really made life difficult for entrepreneurs in India. And we now have to reverse those sins of the past if we want to treat entrepreneurs like citizens, if we want to think about ourselves as governing, not ruling, and we want to harness the immense latent energy among Indians, which today is held back by, prohibited till permitted, enforcing the unenforceable. Drunk driving is an argument against cars. There are so many toxic administrative philosophies which hold us back. And fundamentally, we must recognize that the US trade negotiation has been very difficult because very often the US says, what does India have to offer me? The only lesson from this US trade negotiation is we have to make ourselves stronger. I go back to my Ramdhari Singh Dinkar, Shama Shobhati us bhujang ko jiske paas garal ho. Only snakes with venom can be kind, benevolent, and generous. Toothless, venomous snakes can't do anything. So I think the biggest lesson from the last year of difficulty with US trade negotiation is India needs to make ourselves stronger. We may be fourth in total GDP, but we're 128th in per capita GDP. And that is very painful personally for me 35 years after reform. So while 1991 was important, it was incomplete. We must recognize that. There is a lot of work still to be done to enable, to free entrepreneurs to do the work that they do well. And when we free it, we see the results like we've seen, say, in UPI or we've seen in many other areas. But manufacturing being stuck at 11% of our labor force, which is almost the same as the US, is a child of regulatory cholesterol.
Right. All of what you're saying, the scale and nature of it seems vast and complex. How do we even begin to do this? I mean, do you think that we should do this at the margin, like the government has been trying with, let's say, the labor codes that we're going to talk about, where they've compressed it into 4 codes now? Or let's say, infusing professional folks into the administrative or let's say the foreign services and so on? Or do you think that this requires broad sweeping reforms, something of the type that the US tried to do with DOGE and so on, right? Where you consolidate everything and you look at everything with first principles again and do a execution 2.0 kind of a thing.
It'll be a bit of all, right? But I think that publishing principles for decriminalization, which now we have done, DPIT, which is part of the Ministry of Commerce, has published 10 principles for decriminalization. I think if we apply those 10 principles with earnestness, 80% of criminal provisions will go away. You don't need a criminal provisions, which BNS has. Every ministry has criminal provisions for obstruction of civil servant, of impersonation of civil servant, filing document. That all exists in BNS. So now we have recently, the government has published Jan Vishwas Siddhant, which is 10 principles for deregulation. I think if you apply those 10 principles with earnestness, with honesty, and with a consistent tone from the top, 70-80% of licenses, inspections, multiple instruments, multiple sources of truth will go away. So I'm not sure. See, DOGE, I think, he took on government expenditure and government employment rather than taking on the regulatory cholesterol. In my mind, I think India should start with regulatory cholesterol. The Indian state, India is a very large country. I think we may actually have less civil servants than we need in education or in healthcare or in the police. But we have too many civil servants in other areas, right? And so I would say right now, let's not focus on civil service employment or government expenditure. Though I would submit government expenditure is not working. Total government expenditure has gone up 108 times since 1990. per capita income has only gone up 8 times. The government now spends 110 lakh crores across the state, center, and municipalities. This was only 90,000 crores in 1990. So if fiscal deficits could make countries rich, why would any country bother being poor, right? So I think it's not as impossible as it looks from the outside, and as people think. I think deregulation is just an idea whose time had not come because of the suspicion of the private sector, because the civil service had become clever at positioning drunk driving as an argument against cars. But if you have drunk drivers, you don't ban cars on the road, you issue licenses. So I think deregulation, decriminalization, combined with digitization, why don't we have enterprise digital public infrastructure? We have digital public infrastructure for payments. We had digital public infrastructure for COVID. We have it for FASTag. We have it for airport entry. Why don't we have digital public infrastructure for enterprises? Why is not all my filing digital? Why don't we have an entity DigiLocker? We have an individual DigiLocker. Why don't we have a single enterprise number? We have 23 enterprises number from the government, every company. You have an Aadhaar number for 1.2 billion people. Why don't we have API-driven websites rather than PDF-driven websites? Makes no sense. That's not digitization. So I think it's quite obvious to me that the problem is not what is to be done, it is how it is to be done. And if we have a tone from the top which says that, look, we trust our entrepreneurs, we're moving to trust-based regulation rather than fear-based, rather than distrust-based regulation, this can be done within 12 months.
Wow. Okay.
Yes.
What do you think would unlock? What do you think 2-3 other unlocks could be? Infrastructure. I think we've made some headway there. Capital has come in, as you've described. Let's say deregulation happens at whatever pace, right? I mean, we move in the right direction. What do you think are the 2-3 other big ideas for us to get to 10 or 12K per capita in the next?
That would just be human capital. Finally, the only renewable energy any country has is human capital. That Buddha used to say, Atmadipo Bhav, right? Be your own light. I think the lack of global university pipeline from India is quite worrying. The public universities, yes, we have IITs, yes, we have ISC, but consistently among the top 100, top 200, we have very few universities. And so I think the regulatory cholesterol which companies faced was also very big for universities. You could not have private universities expanding. You could not have them doing the kind of research, paying their faculty, charging fees, raising research money, raising endowments, building the Harvard, Stanford, Yale. In the US, that project took 100 years. The youngest university among the top 100 is the average life is 125 years old, and the average size is 40,000. The smallest university is 23,000. So I think Indian universities need a lot of renewal. Some of it has begun, but we still have to recognize that if India's pharmaceutical industry makes 50% of the world's medicines, it only makes 4% of the world's medicine revenues. Right? It makes 500 billion pills every year. The world had 1,000 billion or 1 trillion pills. But it only makes $65 billion in revenue out of $1.4 trillion in revenue for pharmaceuticals as a whole. Why? Because the science and the university and the knowledge ecosystem of India now needs to step up so that we can discover new chemical entities. So we can have basic science research, which then can be technologically converted. So we have to rethink our CSIRs and our university ecosystem. There was a big debate between Meghnad Saha and Jawaharlal Nehru, where Meghnad Saha said, put our research ecosystem into universities, while Nehru said, no, I'll put it into separate institutes. And I think that has been a mistake. And our universities have not become the vessel. So I think finally, if we want to compete in military technology, because dual-use technology, there's no such thing as military technology anymore. All technologies are dual-use, as the Ukraine war has showed. If we want to compete in medicine, if we want to do computational, why did DeepSeek come out of China and not come out of India is a profound but important question. It didn't cost the $200 billion which Sam Altman was saying you need for large language models, which was just self-serving American interest to say nobody else should try it. And so I think for us as a nation, going towards recognizing that knowledge, which we always valued as a civilization, was also really held back in the last sort of 100 years by regulatory cholesterol.
Right. I want to take a tangent and talk about that wonderful post that you wrote about the Ashoka University, recent incidents that have happened there and so on, right? Where you, I think, argued for more responsibility from the students as well and to be acutely aware of the privilege that they have, right? Do you want to talk about a little more about that? Because what we see in elite universities, at least from here, along with the scientific research and all of that, is a lot of activism that plays out on campuses that has spilled over to their mainstream politics as well now. So, while 5 years back or something, you could just say that, hey, this is just relegated to campuses, it's had a massive spill out into the society and into everyday life as well. Do you fear that something like that could happen in India as well with our elite universities, or is it already happening?
Well, I think some idealism is good when you're young, right? I think that life will force you to recognize that life is second best at best when you grow older. But that doesn't mean a lack of idealism. I actually think that recognizing you campaign in poetry but you govern in prose is more ambitious than governing in poetry. Right? You don't govern in poetry. Slogans don't change the world. Activism doesn't change the world. Being strategic about power is what changes the world, right? Understand what vested interests are, because there are vested interests in everything. Change is inevitable, but change is always resisted by the status quo because there are some people benefiting. For example, in economics, why did the license Raj take so long to dismantle? Because there were many businessmen who benefited from the license Raj. Why are people fighting MNRIGS is dismantling? Because they are vested interests who are interested in keeping it alive. Why were only Punjab farmers fighting for the lack of the farm reform? Because they were beneficiaries of that. So I think the activism when you're young is useful to remind ourselves about what is possible. But life is the art of the possible. It is about recognizing that changing India, changing the world, recognizes that there are power structures which exist. Some of those power structures are useful, but some of those power structures are dysfunctional and need to be dismantled. Now, the question is, how do you dismantle the regulatory state in India? How do you change labor laws which encourage the substitution of people with capital? Right? Why did we adopt an economic system in 1955 where today our labor is handicapped without capital and our capital is handicapped without labor? It makes no sense in a labor surplus country. Now, you can take the zero-sum view of the world where you say that the only way to become rich is to take it money from the poor. Or you could take an abundance view of the world, which says that actually growing the pie is more important than cutting small pieces of it. And from a socialist economic structure that we tried in the 1950s, kept us poor. Instead of Garibi Hatao, why aren't we thinking of Amiri Banao, right? So I would say that the activism which we have seen in universities is useful if it reminds us of the many injustices which exist in India. But it has to shift beyond admiring the problem, behind describing the problem, to trying to solve the problem. And that requires a bit of a shift in a mindset where the only Karl Marx quote I use is, philosophers describe the problem, but the point, however, is to change it, right? So are we going to change in India through fiscal policy? Because many of the activism I hear is about spending more government money. But government spending has gone up 108 times since 1990. Per capita income has only gone up 8 times. So government fiscal policy may not be the solution to poverty in India. Monetary policy is not. I have spent a few years on the RBI board. I haven't decided whether monetary policy is a placebo or a painkiller or a steroid. It's definitely not a medicine. So what is the solution? It is productivity. It is productivity of your cities, it is productivity of your states, it is productivity of your enterprises, it is productivity of your sectors, and it is the productivity of the individuals. So I would love to see activism to fix government schools. It's an embarrassing, one of the most embarrassing numbers about India is only 45% of our kids are left in government schools. If anything should be free in a country, At high quality, it should be K-12 education. Only 5% of kids in Japan go to private school. Only 10% of kids in the UK go to private school. Only 15% of kids in the US go to private school. Why are we not seeing activism on fixing government schools? Why are we not seeing activism on fixing ITIs? Why aren't we seeing activism on fixing employment exchanges? So the notion that, somehow left liberals are the custodians of morality, actually, I think they have lower ambition than other people. The people who say, I will work with the existing system rather than throw stones at it from the outside. I will offer solutions rather than much more detailed descriptions. It's a long overdue updation of what priors, these people like to use. Their assumptions about how societies change are actually quite outdated.
Right.
And their methods are actually quite discredited. We tried this socialism, this zero-sum game view of life. I think prosperity matters more than inequality. I mean, if you threw Gautam Adani, Nandan Nilekani, and Kiran into the Indian Ocean, India's Gini coefficient would improve. But the poor wouldn't care, right? We have to raise our median household income. This politics of jealousy of, there are billionaires, there's inequality in India. Actually, one reason why I admire Deng Xiaoping for many reasons, but one of the things he said, some people will get rich before others. And he not only meant it in terms of people, he also meant in terms of regions. It's hard to take people to jobs, in jobs to people. You have to bring people to jobs in the short run. So what if the north and east have not developed as far as the south and west of India? Let some migration happen. But then at some point, those people will get their act together again. So I think the activism is only useful if it offers solution. The poverty industry in India gets very upset when progress and growth happens because they'll be put out of business.
Right.
So I think that it's time for us to call out the poverty industry. It's time to call out the activism for activists' sakes. And it's time for us to tell people that actually there is more ambition in getting things done than in describing them or admiring the problems India has. So I think that we do need universities, we do need people who think for a living, we do need basic science, but the gap between thinkers and doers has to reduce, right? My favorite military historian was a guy called Thucydides. He said any army that has too much of a gap between its thinkers and doers will have its fighting done by fools and its thinking done by cowards. That gap has, unfortunately, in India increased quite a bit, with the university system retreating to an ivory tower, which has lost touch with reality. They don't see what has happened in India in the last 10 years as a deepening of democracy, right? They are used to being gatekeepers. The elite used to hang out in, within 5 miles of Khan Market or India International Center and sort of believe that they represented India. I think that democracy has deepened substantially in India in the last 10 years because you are hearing voices, you are hearing communities, you are hearing people that would never have been heard under the older system. So I wouldn't shut down this activism on campuses as long as young people are doing it from a perspective of clarifying their own thinking on what should be India's goals, what should be India's strategy, and what should be India's values. But I think some of it has gone overboard to where they just are professional activists. Their job is activism, not solving problems. I think that's unhelpful.
Yeah, they're probably too vested in the problem itself to do anything about it.
Yeah, I just think they're less ambitious. I just think, they always talk about idealism as being the most ambitious people. I don't think idealists are the most ambitious people. I think that life is second best at best. Yeah. So if you keep targeting first best solutions, you will get nothing done. Take the second best solution, make progress, make that base camp, and then make progress from there. As Deng Xiaoping used to say, cross the river by feeling the stones. I don't care if a cat is black or white if it catches mice.
Yeah.
So I think that from a theory of change perspective, it would be wonderful if these articulate, educated people updated their priors to recognize that India is not reducing poverty at the speed that it can. It is not putting poverty in the museum that it should be. And being 128th in per capita income is not just a representation of poor economics. It represents poor healthcare, it represents poor education, it represents poor justice systems, it represents poor city governance, because resources are needed for everything. See, only people who don't run institutions or raise money talk about resources as some source of compromise or betrayal of fear.
Yeah. So less economists and more entrepreneurs and real world operators in some sense.
No, I think economists just need to. There are a lot of pragmatic economists. Unfortunately, the ones we hear in India tend to sort of idealize socialism or a bigger state. I think nostalgia is usually amnesia. I don't think there was a golden age for Indian economics in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. But I think that we just need more teamwork.
Right.
The government has an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, non-profits have a scale deficit. I think we need economists, we need sociologists, we need entrepreneurs, we need honest civil servants with ambition, we need politicians who carry voices and are representative of people. I just think that the notion that the entitled politicians, the entitled civil servants, the entitled entrepreneurs, their time is ending. And that's a good thing.
Right. You've argued before that where you work is a huge determinant to how much you earn, right? Which is, of course, true. Right. But this also results in sort of a concentration of growth, right? I mean, people migrating into the cities, and you have you have growth spread across 6 to 10 cities instead of the many hundreds or even thousands of villages and tier 2 cities, towns and whatnot, right? As we grow further, don't you think this will create a bit of a strain in the likes of Bangalore or Delhi or Bombay and so on? And if that is the case, how would you argue for a more decentralized growth? I mean, what would that be like?
Well, what is power in government? Funds, functions, and functionaries. If you track who has the money, who has the power to give approvals, who has the employees, unfortunately in India, we have only 12 cities, well, maybe 50 cities with more than 1 million people, but we have 12 mega cities. See, mega cities are a recent and an Asian invention. In 1973, there were only 3 cities with more than 10 million people, Tokyo, New York, and Mexico. Now there are 33 cities in the world, of which 28 are in Asia and 12 are in India. I think that it was a constitutional blind spot to not give funds, functions, and functionaries to the third tier of government. Even though people talk about an attempt made in the 80s and 90s to give power, but it really wasn't giving power. And anyway, we like devolution to our level. So now that we have the state government spend more than the central government. For the first 70 years, the central government spent more than all state governments combined. Last 5 years now, and in a few years, state governments will spend 50% more than the central government. But they are now unwilling to give the money to the cities, right? 100 mayors matter more than 29 chief ministers. I think 29 chief ministers matter more than one prime minister. So I think it has been a constitutional blind spot, and now it is choked at the level of vested interest to not devolve power to the city leadership. And the notion that city leadership is more corrupt than state leadership and state leadership is more corrupt than central leadership is not true. I think there is levels of corruption at all levels of government. I think we can reduce that corruption in the way we frame our laws, in the way we think about criminal provisions, in the way we think about many things. So I would say that building 50 to 100 cities with more than 1 million people, or taking some of our existing cities and equipping them to attract jobs rather than send migrants, is an important project for the next sort of 25 years. The UP chief minister just formed an economic advisory council, which I joined, and I thought he was very thoughtful in his first meeting. He said there are 37 flights from UP to Bangalore every day. You take away all our children. Now we want to keep them. So tell me what to do. How do we not send all our kids to Bangalore? Let's keep them in UP. And I think if every chief minister in India starts thinking like that, we will have some competition for deregulation. We will have competition for human capital. We will have competition for infrastructure. We will have competition for law and order. I think UP is going to no longer be classified with Bihar in law and order. It still has a lot of catching up to do in economics. But law and order is the basis, right, of any. You can't build prosperity without peace.
Yeah.
So I think that this notion that India will always have to take people to jobs should be challenged by 29 chief ministers in the next 25 years, where they take charge of their habitat and which they should fight for devolution of powers. Indira Gandhi in 15 of her speeches said strong states lead to a weak nation. I think that was a very myopic view of the world. In fact, the constitutional amendment in 1976, which made many things which were state subjects onto the concurrent list, at some point we should have a debate for reversing. India cannot be run from Delhi. We must give power to chief ministers, and chief ministers should then give powers to mayors. So I think the only way to solve this mega city problem, this concentration of people in 12 cities in India, is to devolve funds, functions, and functionaries to chief ministers with some sort of mechanism or incentive for them to devolve it further to cities.
Right. I have to ask, any thoughts on judicial reforms? Because this enforcement of contracts seems to be a critical thing. Again, when you talk about ease of doing business and so on, you've said that corruption is the transmission loss between the way laws are written, interpreted, and executed, right? And I feel like along with civil service reforms, judicial reforms is one of those key things that we need. And
but
we need
deregulation will make a huge difference. See, we criminalized check bouncing 10 years ago. It is now 43 lakh cases. 15% of cases in courts are now check bouncing cases. It makes no sense. If you add another traffic violations, it's another 15% of cases. So by decriminalizing check bouncing and by finding alternate decriminalized methods for dealing with traffic violation, we could get rid of almost 10 million cases. So I think, yes, of course, we need to think about how courts can be more digitized, how they can be more efficient, how they can move away from the tariq pe tariq and all that. But we also first should hold up a mirror to our own laws and regulations made by the legislature or the bureaucracy in saying that when you make laws that are unenforceable, enforcing the unenforceable is what one labor commissioner told me about past labor laws. Well, when you enforce the unenforceable, you will clog up the court system, right? And then process becomes punishment. But process is punishment only for the innocent. For guilty love, process is punishment because the punishment is not being meted out. With the innocent, the punishment has already been given. So I would say, yes, we do need the court system to hold up a mirror to itself and recognize what Ghalib said, धूल चेहरे पे थी मैं आईना साफ करता रहा the dust was on my face but I used to keep cleaning the mirror. I think the Supreme Court judges and High Court judges have to recognize that they have an important part to play in making sure that timely justice is provided. But I would say in laws and regulations, if you got rid of for example, decriminalized check bouncing, 43 lakh cases would somehow go away. If you decriminalize a lot of the traffic violations, many would go away. There are alternative ways to do this that many societies use. So I'm not trivializing the fact that but a check bounce is a commercial contract between two consenting adults. It's not a criminal provision in any other part of the world.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about labor reforms. You've long argued for this. Do you think the government has smartened up in its enactment of these reforms? I mean, learned from the farm laws debacle, right, and the pushback that it got, and it's somehow trying to introduce it in a way that is more palatable to people, or why do we not see the kind of reaction that we saw for, let's say, the farm laws?
Yeah, I think the government has done a good job of balancing the multiple stakeholders. I think, there is a madhyam marg between no labor laws, which I don't think are a good idea, but the labor laws that India had, which I didn't think were a good idea either. I think there are very few employers who would disagree with the non-negotiables of labor laws. You should have safety. You should have good working conditions. You should have leave. You should have minimum wages. But the thousands of other labor laws, which essentially made an employment contract marriage without divorce, were inappropriate for a world where employment has shifted from being a lifetime contract to a taxi cab relationship, in a world which recognizes salary as only one component of CTC. Benefits come out of CTC, they're not over and above CTC. So I think we have struck the right balance in the labor codes. I think we should have had one labor code instead of four labor codes. But, life is second best at best. Now that we have 29 or 37 laws coming down, whichever way you view it, to four labor codes, I think that most employers will acknowledge that there has been a substantial reduction in licenses, in inspections, in provisions, in criminal provisions. It's almost an 80% reduction. Now, can you quibble about saying that the gratuity should have not been tweaked, the calculation of basic for provident should not be tweaked? I mean, there's a negotiation going on and the final rules will be this. But I think that a democracy like India will not be like China. And I think there has been no reaction also because of trade unions becoming a geriatric ward. They do not represent the interests of the youth. Job preservation is not a form of job creation. Why are trade unions not fighting for reforming ESI? It is one of the world's worst health insurance programs. Why are trade unions not fighting for reforming EPFO? It is impossible to get your money out of EPFO. It is one of the most expensive government securities mutual funds in the world. Why aren't trade unions fighting for that? So I think it makes no sense for trade unions to position themselves as representative of employees. They have not been representatives of employees for decades. They have been self-serving, self-referential clubs of geriatric men focused on perpetuating their own eliteness. There is a need for a voice of labor in a society, but trade unions haven't been it. And that's why their calls for fighting against labor codes have not been resonating with the youth of India. The youth of 65% of India is less than 35 years old. They don't believe job preservation is a form of job creation.
Right. Do you think that in the interim period it increases some business overheads? I mean, when you talk about workplace safety, for instance, right, or some of these PF provisions and so on, right? I mean, do you think that competitiveness of enterprises in the short term may be impacted by this?
Let's wait for the rules. There's a lot of negotiation going on right now. The rules have not been notified. Corporate India has raised 2-3 points that they think could be problematic. Let's wait for the final rules to be notified. I think corporate India will not be as disappointed as they are right now. But in the long run, salaries going up is a point of reform. I think beyond a point, right? I mean, we need per capita income to go up. We need productivity to go up. Obviously, corporate India is not going to be forced to pay above market rates. I think that is clear. I believe that labor markets are not like equity markets. Equity markets clear on price, labor markets clear on information. But we are very far from Arthur Louise's Louisian turning point where we have run out of farm labor. So I think corporate India should not be forced to pay above productivity wages. And I think the labor code does a reasonable job. There are 2-3 points of niggling on that. We'll see when the final rules are notified whether a Madhyam Marg is found on those 2 points.
Right. What the government has tried to do over the last 10 years is to position formalization as there's incentives to formalization, yes. Right? Because earlier, if you formalize, I mean, you have the opposite of that. You have the taxman, yes. Who comes behind you. With these codes, right? Do you think that spirit is sort of maintained?
Yes, absolutely. I think the benefits of formalization are approaching to be much higher than the costs of formalization. I think that there are 2 points around gratuity, provident fund, and a few calculations, but everything else on the labor codes is encourages formalization. It incentivizes formalization, and I think you will see an increase in people's willingness and ability to. And more importantly, it gives a lot of power to states. I mean, the difference between our poorest and richest states is 5 times. In America, it's 2 times. Japan is 3 times. In China, is 4 times. So I think that the Industrial Disputes Act, which gives you the power to, without going to the government for retrenchment, it has raised it from 100 to 300, but it has given states the ability. I know some states like UP, Maharashtra, which are considering making this 10,000, 50,000. I think there are many other areas of labor codes where states will have the power to craft their own habitats under the labor codes, which they did not have in prior labor laws in India. So I think decentralization as a broader theme, which we talked about for urbanization or for many things, in labor codes, it has been codified.
Right. Someone I know just told me that, look, it's not that the job losses are happening because of AI or whatever. Yes, we may have overhired over the last 3 years. I'm talking specifically about the tech sector, but it's also that, Indian firms have kind of accepted this American culture wholesale, right? And they're more open to letting people go, right? Mm-hmm. Do you think that culture can be superimposed to India? I mean, even in the elite, let's say the tech sector itself?
See, shareholders don't pay salaries, customers do. This is a myth that companies decide that they want to hire or fire people. Customers decide they want to hire or fire people. And customers pay salaries. Beyond a point, it is a myth that companies pay salaries. Companies, if customers go on strike like they did in COVID, then how do companies pay salaries, right? So I don't think there is anything hire and fire peculiar about America or India. I think the world is becoming much more competitive. The average life expectancy of Fortune 500 company has come down from 64 to 15 in the last 75 years. I think Europe's model, which people tend to idealize, as Angela Merkel just pointed out, that it's unsustainable. She said Europe is, 7% of the world's population, 25% of the world's GDP, but 50% of the world's social spending. That is not sustainable. So I think the notion that employers can provide social security is a bit of a myth, right? Employers can provide. Employment has shifted from a lifetime contract to a taxi cab relationship for various reasons, right? I think a modern state is a welfare state. How you finance that welfare state, do you finance it by taxes or debt, is the question. I think it's too high a bar to expect employers to provide social security, to provide hospitals, to provide creches, to substitute for the state. I think that is too high a bar for employers. And most people, when they think of employers, think of the Tata, Birla, Infosys, and HDFC. But most employers are medium-sized employers, So regulatory cholesterol actually doesn't hurt big employers as much as it hurts small employers. So I don't think this hire and fire culture of the US is particularly US. As businesses become more competitive, they can only handle a certain amount of fixed costs and they need to variabilize their costs. Because then you can handle peaks and troughs of volatility. Is it better for a company to die, or is it better for a company to be resilient? Is it better to company to have 500 secure jobs than 700 insecure ones? I think beyond the point is decided by the market rather than by shareholders or managers.
Right. Let's shift our focus to federalism. Do you think that the power structure has devolved in such a way that the states have more power today versus, let's say, 5 or 10 years back? And is that necessarily a good thing, in the sense that if you see the mismanagement of finances, right, in, let's say, where we are right now, let's say in the Karnataka government itself, right, and similar in other states as well. But we're also seeing, for example, AP, Telangana, those folks, doing really well as well. Can we leave it to the individual states to, use the money the way they deem fit, right, without a central structure to sort of oversee where the money is going and what is the nature of accountability and so on? Because otherwise, it creates these short-term incentives which run on election cycles, basically.
Yeah. See, being a good ancestor is no longer as much of an objective as it used to be for bankers, for politicians, for everybody else, right? I think that we mispriced 3 things, or there were market failures in the last 100 years, were mispricing carbon, mispricing care work, but biggest thing was mispricing government debt. And in India, we misprice government debt at a state level even worse, because we don't distinguish between what Bihar pays for its debt and what Maharashtra pays for its debt. For some reason, we thought good federalism meant that Bihar will pay the same amount on its debt as Maharashtra. And there could be a case to be made that politicians won't care on how much you pay for your debt. But I think that it is time for public finance to reflect the differential risk premiums or the differential finances between states. See, today, Punjab is practically bankrupt. It is not able, it is delaying government salaries and will probably not be able to pay them in a few months. But what is the punishment of Punjab? See, thankfully, the US does not allow them to run deficits, but in India, we have an equivalent good cap of a cap on their borrowing. States can't borrow beyond a point. Some states have been very creative in doing off balance sheet borrowing. They have put money in state electricity boards, they have put money in something else. But now I think the new accounting norms, I'm now on the CAG board, and the new accounting norms make it much harder for governments to fudge their borrowing. So I think in a democratic setup, I would disagree with you that it is a central government would somehow be able to discipline state governments, which are also democratically elected. In a complex country like India, India is a very linguistically, religiously large country. There is no other precedent for us in the world, actually. China is the only country comparable in size, but it has no experience and no knowledge in the kind of democratic functioning that India has. So I would suggest that no, we don't need state finances to be controlled by the center, but we need more market mechanisms to discipline states.
To price it accordingly.
We should have a differential pricing for debt for Bihar and this. We should continue the current caps on borrowing. We should continue to tighten the accounting norms that do not allow us to fudge our liabilities. If we create subsidy programs that are paid in the future, they must be accrued in present value to the current value of liabilities. The notion that giving subsidies in the future does not create a current liability is not only accounting myth, it is not only accounting fiction, it is fraud. So state governments are welcome to be bad ancestors and steal from their grandchildren if they want to, but the markets should have a say. The accounting regulators should have a say. And frankly, the debt cap should be applied as a hard stop for cities and for states. And beyond a point, if they're not able to pay civil servants, the consequences, or make capital expenditure, the consequences for them will become obvious. So I think the notion that somehow central governments should control state governments may no longer be possible in a democratic setup. But there are many other ways to discipline state governments which currently are not being used and should be used in India.
Right. You've said that mass democracy is much, much harder than mass prosperity. Yeah. But do you think that somehow mass democracy might be at risk going forward? I say this for a couple of reasons. Let's say, one, the West seems to be obsessed with destabilizing our part of the world. Right. And two, I mean, if you look at, let's say, some of these state north-south divisions, or let's say caste divisions and so on and so forth, these keep flaring up, of course, with external support as well. Do you see that as a risk at all going forward let's say next 5, 10, 15 years?
I don't think so. I think India's mass democracy is very deep-rooted. It is strong. I think you don't have to be Western to be modern anymore. When I grew up, our self-esteem was low. But I think the Western civilization, I think we've seen peak China. I don't know whether we've seen peak US, but the three things that made the US strong, stealing the best people in the world, making public investment in science, and allowing globalization of supply and demand chains, are all being undermined by their current president. So in some sense, America was so far ahead that we would have never caught up. Now wo thoda raaste mein milenge, they are coming. So in some cosmic sense, this is our opportunity if we make ourselves stronger, if we do the deregulation, decriminalization, decentralization, and digitization. This is a real opportunity for India that we did not have in the 90s and 2000s when the US was firing on all cylinders. stealing the best people in the world. So I think mass prosperity is an engineering problem. I think mass democracy is a much more complex problem. And if we can do the complex part of it, where a multilingual, I mean, we're the only country with printed newspapers in 34 languages every day. We are the only country with this amount of religious diversity. And we have, I think mass democracy works. And I'm obviously proud of mass democracy, but it's not clear to me that mass prosperity was something we had to sacrifice for mass democracy. It was a series of choices we made in 1955, in 1968, in 1976 that held back mass prosperity. We reversed some of those choices in 1991, but we didn't reverse all those choices. And if we reverse all those choices now, I have no doubt in my mind that we will add mass prosperity to mass democracy. We will go up from 2,500 to 10, 15, $20,000 per capita income within my lifetime.
Right. For long, the dream was you crack an entrance exam, you do your bachelor's here perhaps, and then go to the US for the master's, and then maybe find employment in one of the FANG companies, right? Housewife, kids, car, everything there. And then you visit India during the summers, right? And make some commentary about how things have changed, right? But I feel like in the last 1 or 2 years, that dream has sort of been undone. It's a very fragile dream right now.
Yes.
What do you think will happen with these folks considering coming back, right? And the folks who are here not wanting to go to the US or not having a choice to go to the US or the West?
I think it's fantastic for India. I think that the Chinese accounting for 1/3 of new chemical entities in pharma last year was purely a child of the returning Chinese in the chemical and pharma industry. I think China's leadership in batteries depended on a few key individuals and a few key companies who came back from the US. So the brain drain can become brain circulation. It can also become brain gain. I mean, we only have a 17 million diaspora. I'm not sure that we should worry about a few people leaving. But every unicorn in India has somebody from the diaspora on their board as an investor and stuff like that. And I don't think the US is as attractive as it used to be. See, there's much more to citizenship than a travel document. It was a myth that people could just talk about citizenship as a travel document. And Trump and many people all over the world are reminding people that there is much more to citizenship than a travel document. And so I have no grudges against people who chose to leave India. But I think now, hopefully, instead of throwing stones at us from there or criticizing us, they will put their shoulder to the wheel, come and help solve many of our big problems. You know, there are many injustices, there are many things, and they have the skills that could accelerate our progress. We have a very cantankerous neighborhood. I don't think we have to worry about America as much as we have to think about China. You know, China is an equal sized country to ours, who broke ahead of us in the last 35 years. But there was no reason. They're not smarter than us. It wasn't God's will that China's per capita income should be 5 times more than us. It was our economic choices. So I think the diaspora coming back, we should welcome them. We should encourage them to invest here. We should encourage them to live here. We should encourage them to build their life here. Because living in a country where people eat the same food as you, speak the same language as you, is totally different and liberating in ways, in spiritual, intellectual, physical ways that many people all over the world are only now being reminded of.
Right. I want to take a tangent and ask you about states in general, right? I think every country in the West is going through this period where they're asking, what is this nation, right? Who are who has first rights to this nation at this point, right? Yeah. And the answers range from, shallow, vague to the farcical, right? And in these situations, the default seems to be some function of ethno-racial definitions of it, right? Yes. And considering these folks have such high significant number of minorities in those states, we're seeing the kind of chaos, unrest, and so on. Yeah. And while the concept of a state has always been questioned, right? I mean, it used to be at the margin, but today it feels like it's spilling over, right? I mean, you're seeing that in presidential elections, you're seeing that spill over to everyday life and so on. In that, I feel like we are very well positioned in the sense that we have a civilizational basis to our state. And we have begun to recognize that more and more. But do you feel like we should be a little more strident not just in our polity, but also in our policy as we, enforce this a little more stridently as we look forward to a Viksit Bharat?
I mean, I think that India has struck the right balance since independence on a constitutional state providing the framework on top of a civilizational state. I think it's silly to think that the constitutional state is when India started, right? That is just untrue and unfair and sort of bigotry. But I think that a civilizational state needed some elements of the constitutional state to pull us all together. We speak very different languages. So I just view the constitution as a set of rules by which we negotiate with each other as very different people. So I think that anybody who says that the civilizational state does not need the constitution is probably stretching it. And anybody who says India started with the constitution is probably stretching it, right? Because South India has very different food, language than North India, right? I mean, but there is an element of Indianness to all of us, which I think was, there was a layer of dust on that, or it was almost, we were embarrassed with that. So I would say that I think we're in a sweet spot. Over the next 25 years, we have learned to negotiate with each other. We have learned to have elections without drama. We have learned to campaign, in defense of politics.
Count votes in one day.
We have learned to do many things that really many other countries are struggling to. We struggle to do many things they do well. I mean, my view of life is, we have to really make ourselves stronger. But we have a strong basis for being strong. We have a civilizational basis. We have cognitive diversity. We have a lot of diversity among our intellectuals, among our institutions, among our chief ministers, and among our citizens. And I think in a world of AI, ML, where engineering problems become commoditized, right? Political intelligence, serendipity intelligence, conversational intelligence, maybe the most important 21st century intelligence is what would I like my kids to learn? I'd like them to learn about getting along with people they don't like. I'd like them to learn how to get more lucky. I'd like to have conversation. Because of our civilizational diversity, many Indians intuitively understand this, right? So I think that it was always known in political science that public goods are hard to create in heterogeneous societies. Why did Scandinavian and American countries were very good at creating public goods when foreign born was only 10%? The minute foreign born has reached 20-25%, they have suddenly started, because they don't have any mechanisms to negotiate. So I think in 1994, when I landed in the US, there was a front page article on the Wall Street Journal which said that India is more interesting than important. I hope that journalist is eating the newspaper on which he wrote that, right? Because what's happening in India is not once in a decade, it's not once in a millennium, it's once in the lifetime of a country. And so I think we should just stay with our brand, which is consistently warm rather than hot or cold. I don't think we'll be doing 11% growth, but I think 7%, 8%, 6%, for 30 years is really good. See, the rich countries became rich by growing at 3% for 100 years. Japan became rich by growing at 12% for 30 years. China became rich by growing at 11% for 20 years. There are fixed costs of democracy. I don't want to live in China. I clearly admire China, but I don't want to live there. So I think 6 to 8% in India is a good, consistent brand of India. If we're at 6, don't worry, we're going to 8. If we're 8, don't worry, we're going to 6. Because inflation will go up, then we'll do something else. So I am actually quite comfortable if we do the deregulation, decriminalization, decentralization, and digitization, we will add mass prosperity to mass democracy.
Final question before we close. The average age of our audience is about 27 years, right? For this segment of the population, what should they be optimistic about going into 2026?
Well, they should be optimists about India's natural position. We are a democracy in a world that is learning the complexities of democracy. We are a civilizational state in a world where constitutional states struggle to anchor themselves. We are a country, 15% of Japan will die in the next 8 years. It's, 65% of India is less than 35 years old. So I think there are many aspects of India that are luck. There are many aspects of India which are skill. Americans ate 400 billion pills last year. India made 200 billion of them. You would not associate that with the poor country. India exported more software than Saudi Arabia did oil. You would not, associate that with the poor country. So I think our skills are high, our luck is high. Our choices around economics were much poorer than our choices around democracy and politics. I think we are in the process of revising those choices. And if we fix those choices, there was nothing ever anything culturally wrong with India. We should never blame culture for the choices we make. That is not taking responsibility for our problems. So I think we should be optimistic about our place in the world, but more importantly, about the direction of travel. I think many European countries are very rich, but their direction of travel is in the wrong direction.
Right.
I think UK is in clinical depression and is probably but it's not clear what they can do. Are they going to reverse Brexit? Are they going to what is the United Kingdom's economy going to represent? And I think for India, it is very clear that we will go from being 5 trillion to 10 trillion to 15 trillion, provided we take responsibility for our faults and we are proud of our strengths.
Right. All right, sir. On that note, we'll end the podcast at this point. Thank you so much for being on Bharat Varta again. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Take care. Godspeed for next year.